morning on 2FM.
2FM.
Now, in her recent quarterly letter, the CEO of YouTube, Susan Wojcicki, said that YouTube's commitment to openness meant leaving up content that might actually be seen as controversial or even offensive. Increasingly, though, online platforms like YouTube and Facebook are coming under scrutiny, with some believing that they're being weaponised by extremists as tools of radicalisation. But how does online radicalisation actually occur? And do companies like YouTube have a responsibility to protect users from harmful content? Well, Professor Maura Conway of DCU's School of Law and Government joins me now to shed some light. Welcome to the programme, Maura. Maura, first of all, when we talk about online radicalisation, which people hear a lot about, what exactly do we mean?
Yeah, so mostly when we talk about online radicalisation, actually in our research, we say violent online radicalisation. And what we are talking about when we say that is, I guess, the process by which individuals come to be radicalised, so come to adopt increasingly extreme political positions. And often, like I say, in our case, they come to view violence as a legitimate means for resolving social and political issues. And this is as a result of their online content consumption and interactions.
Okay, but how have the internet and social media platforms in general changed the process of radicalisation?
Well,
we're talking the internet 30 years old this year.
That's right.
Right, okay.
Right. So I actually first began to do work on this issue back in the late 1990s. And in fact, violent extremists and terrorists have a very long history online. So this isn't something that's wholly new, though it's getting a lot more attention these days. So the extreme right actually were some of the first people to do politics on the internet full stop. And they set up these bulletin board systems way back in the really early days of the net, in the early 1980s, in fact. But things really didn't begin to heat up in this domain, if you like, until the mid-1990s. And in the mid-1990s, a whole bunch of terrorist organisations began to set up websites for a variety of purposes, but mainly really to get the word out to global publics about their causes without an intervening sort of media, if you like.
Without having to do what they used to do, which was some BBC reporter.
Correct.
I made it into the camp of these people, blah, blah, blah. And
Correct.
I was allowed in, provided blah, 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 and I was checked in.
That's right.
All that
That's
stuff.
right.
They don't need to do that anymore.
No, they didn't need to do that anymore. So for a time there, between the mid-1990s and the mid-2000s, what you had was these websites, and then latterly the use of online forums and whatnot. The websites were quite top-down in their orientation, so it wasn't possible for people to have a whole lot of interaction with the people who had developed the websites, for example. But from the early 2000s and into the mid-2000s, like I say, what you get is a shift to online forums, so there's more of a possibility for interaction. And then, as we know, in the early to mid-2000s, you get a shift to social media. And that changes things pretty considerably, because now what you have is the possibility for people who are involved in violent extremist and terrorist organisations to reach out very widely to other people worldwide, especially young people, it has to be said, and to be in touch with them in really direct ways. And so that's what they did. They reached out to especially young people via Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and a whole host of other social media
So
companies.
in general then, the internet creates more opportunities to be radicalised, but the internet acts as an echo chamber, doesn't it? A place where individuals find their ideas supported and echoed by other like-minded individuals.
Yeah, I think it's definitely fair to say that, because as you might imagine, once upon a time, if, for example, you lived in a small village in the west of Ireland, let's say, you would have found it pretty difficult to find other people who, say, identified with neo-Nazi ideology or violent jihadi ideology or any other type of...
And now it's the same as going to a meeting in a major city on 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But you can also, it doesn't have to be 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. It can be any time of any day, and you can very easily reach out and find people who share whatever views.
So
you might
fair
have.
to say that in your experience, the internet actually accelerates the process of radicalisation and allows radicalisation to occur without any kind of physical content, and that's physical contact, and that's huge.
Yeah, that is really pretty significant, I think. So what a lot of people would say is that many more people are being exposed to violent extremist and terrorist content, and that this is a problem, because even though only relatively small numbers of people actually eventually engage themselves with these groups and actually take part in violence, for example, it's nonetheless probably more people than were involved with these previously, because of the just much greater ease of access.
Okay, well, all of this is kind of, it makes total sense to anybody, I presume, in some ways, like that. Like, you know, I presume there are common methods, and if so, yeah, if there are, what methods are most common in online radicalisation? I
guess what I would say is that, there's a whole variety of people who have violent extremist views, and they're all the time now producing content and circulating it online. So people get introduced to this content in various ways. Sometimes they go looking for it themselves, and that's quite commonplace. But sometimes also they get introduced to it as a result of the recommender systems and that kind of thing that are being employed by social media companies. So I guess a lot of the time what social media companies would say is that, they're just acting as a platform, they're just hosting the user content, and they don't really have an editorial role. And yeah, you made that point earlier with respect to YouTube. However, more and more researchers are focusing on, for example, YouTube and other platforms that have similar recommender systems, and saying, well, hang on a sec, that's not entirely accurate, because once somebody looks for a certain type of content, YouTube recommends them more of that content. And sometimes that can work out really neatly. If you're interested in a certain sport or, a certain type of music or whatnot, you can be introduced to new music that you mightn't otherwise have been introduced to, because the recommender system works well. However, it works the same for all kinds of content. So if you're interested in neo-Nazism, for example, for whatever reason, you just look up some of this type of content, well, you'll be recommended more and more neo-Nazi content. And a concern is that you will be recommended more and more extreme content of this type also. And so there is good research out there. We did some research ourselves a number of years ago, pointing this out, that it's not just about the users, that online radicalization oftentimes is a sort of a co-production, if you like, between the users on the one hand and the platforms on the other hand.
Okay, well then let's take a look at this, because what you're saying is that most people don't start off maybe looking for extreme content online, but algorithms on sites like YouTube's that create the rabbit holes that you mentioned there.
Yep.
But I mean, the individual experience of the internet and the engagement of the individual with it during the radicalisation. Just you mentioned good research. You mentioned your own research too. How much is really known?
Well, it's a relatively difficult thing to research, and a lot of the research that has been done has focused very much over the last number of years on the so-called Islamic State and their online activity, and that made sense because they had a very well thought out online strategy. They were producing very significant amounts of content that they were circulating very, very widely on major social media platforms for some time, and now they've been pushed a little bit to the fringes because of the very major disruption of their content production and their circulation of that content on the major platforms. Today, there's more of a focus on the extreme right and their online activity, and new research is emerging about that all the time. However, a lot of the research does indeed focus on the content, so it focuses more on the content and less on the actual users. But there is more research emerging that has more of a focus, one, on users, which I think is important, but also two, on the role of the platforms in all of this, which is important too.
But also, like, we haven't mentioned, people with malicious or predatory agendas. We haven't mentioned grooming or anything like that, which is the same. It's in the same ballpark here. Mm-hmm. To target the vulnerable. There are a lot of people who are there who aren't anything but vulnerable and are absolutely ripe for being radicalised.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case.
And I'm not stupid enough to think that everybody is that.
No,
Yeah.
no, but obviously there are a lot of people online. There are a lot of people who spend a lot of time online. Many of those are quite young people.
Yeah.
Many of them are relatively unsupervised. And so given the increasing amounts of especially extreme right content, so if we were talking about an Irish or a European context, for example, there is increasing amounts of extreme right content circulating online. It is doing so on a really wide variety of platforms, major platforms, but also platforms that are more trafficked by young people, like gaming platforms and that kind of thing. So it's definitely the case that the people who are producing that content are interested in having youth and others to come to identify with their, in many cases, extreme right-wing views. So certainly it's a concern.
Yeah, okay. Well then, if we say that the internet offers, terrorists or extremists or whatever, the capability to do the three threes, the communicate, the collaborate and the convince, if that's the case, you can spot it, or you can spot a lot of it anyway. So what's the next step? How does one prevent?
Yeah, it's a very difficult thing because actually it took quite some time for the major social media companies to get their act together with regard to...
Wait a minute, are you saying they've got their act together?
Well, hold on a moment. So they have got their act together in some respect with regard to the so-called Islamic State. But actually that wasn't immediate. So their disruption of not even Islamic State was immediate. But over a number of years, from 2014 to 2016, pressure was brought to bear on them with regard to that organisation in particular. And IS had, between 2014, 2016, even into 2017, pretty large and vibrant communities on major social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, what have you. But over that time, the companies began to take some pretty serious steps to disrupt those communities. And today, it's really quite difficult to access so-called Islamic State content on major social media platforms. The same can't be said about extreme right content. There's very large amounts of extreme right content out there. More and more of it is being produced every day, and it's much more difficult for the companies to respond effectively to that content than it was to IS content. And that's for a number of reasons. One of them is that Islamic State was and is a terrorist organisation. It is designated as such by every major country on earth. It didn't have the support of any government, really, certainly not explicit support. Whereas, on the other hand, the extreme right is a really sort of complex overlapping of groups and movements and people and media organs and whatnot. So there isn't one overarching group that we can point to and say we need to deal with them.
Okay, well then on that level, then finally, in your opinion, does the need to curb extreme content trump the whole idea of YouTube's desire to remain an open platform?
No, I think it's a tricky issue. I think that a balance has to be reached. I think no more than with Islamic State, it's going to take some time to arrive at some, agreed upon position. I think arriving at that agreed upon position is going to be tricky with respect to, in particular, extreme right content because of issues, in particular, between the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America, which gives a lot of leeway as regards speech, versus, say, a lot of European countries which favour, much more greatly regulation of, in particular, hate and extremist content.
Okay, well, one of the things finally is the Facebook announced updates to improve how they combat terrorism and violent extremism, content matching, banning, a combination of AI and human expertise expertise to remove content praising or supporting extreme or hate organisations and that. But to me, it sounds like it is just a tip of an iceberg, and it's a hugely complex story which will obviously roll on for a good while yet. So Professor Maura Conway of DCU's School of Law and Government, thanks a million, Maura, for dropping into us on the programme today.
Thanks, Dave.
Dave Fanning on 2FM. 2FM.